12 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory, and 326 gigabytes.
What name springs to mind first when you think of video or computer games? Now don't rush into that answer just yet. Take your time, pause the video, and then paste it into the comments below. Are you done? You see, the answer will always depend on your age, and I'm certain to see Nintendo, Sega, Xbox and PlayStation and more below. But for me and others of a similar age, it all started much earlier by names no longer uttered. Commodore, Magnavox, Sinclair, Acorn, Amstrad. But by far the biggest and original was the mighty Atari. The passion project of Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney was the epitome of the modern casual startup company dream with a carefree and wild business style. Fresh from the very first commercial arcade game in computer space in 1972, the company almost single-handedly created arcade games and then later home consoles. As not only a new pastime for many, but a massive commercial explosion of an entire new market. They blossomed over the following years with many changes of tact, owners and hardware, but today we start at the end of the line. They say cats have 9 lives, and with Atari's final pet, their number was certainly up. Now the Atari Jaguar was many things. It was the first 64-bit console on the market. Kind of. It was packed with a myriad of processors before Sega went full chip shop mode with the Saturn, and it was Atari's final piece of hardware, and most of all, it was the final failure for the daddy of video games. It was the end of the line for the company that started the biggest entertainment industry of today. From the legendary 70s Pong craze and home machines, the very first barrier-breaking game, to the iconic VCS, the video computer system. It's never been called the Atari 2600 as far as I'm concerned. That was a post, very much a post name added on once the 5200 was launched. Now these all launched in the mid-70s or late 70s with matching wooden US station wagon design and then the later Darth Vader model. Now Atari were doing the Google or Apple thing long before they ever bit a bite, but the fire that burns twice as bright burns half as long. The journey from the start of this behemoth along the arcades, the VCS, the brilliance of the Atari ST and much more besides to the end of the company it used to be, spanning 3 decades, is for other videos. But this one starts at that tail end of its hardware days with a console that had so much promise yet never really had the chance to fulfill it. Primed to pounce on the tail end of the 16-bit era, the prospects looked great on paper, but the issue was a lack of funding to actually launch and manufacture units created a vicious circle of no development from third party due to low install base. It most certainly had the claws to compete, but in the end it lacked the teeth to take any bite out of the market it so desperately wanted to get into. Now in today's look back to our video game history, I kick off our examination of just how good the Jaguar actually was against its peers old and new, while testing the entire 50-strong cartridge library of games, only possible in full due to the excellent Jag SD from Retro HQ, which I've also reviewed alongside this video. Now if you want to complete your entire Jaguar catalogue, check out his site, his Twitter directly and order, or go onto Atari Age and reserve your own from a multitude of third-party sellers. Now let's take a journey back to 1993 when Atari was playing its final hand with only half a deck.
That you can only get with Jaguar, which is more advanced! Good. Can you repeat the question? Jaguar! Jaguar! Jaguar!
The Jaguar was a complex and rushed piece of hardware to market. After a previous run of mistakes and ownership changes, money was running short in the company after a previously started but cancelled Panther console and the Atari Falcon sinking almost instantly, as great as it was. Now they needed a winner to fill the coffers up, and consoles were very much back in fashion. Designed by an external team, something of a Tremere raison d'etre, the same brilliance behind the Sinclair Spectrum, Flare Technologies were an offshoot from Sinclair engineers led by Martin Brennan. Now, after delivering the chipset design for the rejected Panther, the new Flare 2 project, an offshoot from the Conic multi-system, hands up at the back there who remembers that vaporware device. Now, it was loaded with a collection of co-processors and video enhancements with identifying names to suit, sharing a trait with the Commodore Amiga. In fact, the UK-based company from Cambridge clearly had a Hanna-Barbera focus with its Tom and Jerry chips core set. The British company were keen to actually ship a product this time though, but corners were cut, and this left the potential of the hardware hamstrung in some key areas. Now, they joined forces with IBM as their strategic partner to build the machine via their custom process, which caused another issue of late and lower supply than first planned in early 1993 and then into the late 93. Now, this was largely due to that lack of capital. Now, at its heart, this is a hybrid 32-bit machine with a 16 32-bit CPU, which was, oddly enough, not the recommended processor to use for games. Now, the Motorola 68000 was still a prolific CPU at the heart of the majority of 16-bit computers and consoles and even arcades of the time. Clocked at 13.2 MHz, it was still a cracking CPU, but by 1993, it was far from cutting edge. The incoming 3D Shift would need more than just this, which the unit had within its collection of additional co-processors and dedicated GPU-like ASIC. Now, the TOM chip is the graphics workhorse, as it contains the RISC GPU, the Blitter, which handled a great deal of the machine's visual construction from Z-depth, texture mapping, scaling and rotation, and the decent Gurud shading it offered. Again, the first machine into the home market that offered this as base functionality. Even the Model 1 didn't have it at the time. The ALU within this was pretty powerful, and alongside its 4KB data block or scratch pad, which was present to enable the multi-processor to work in tandem without hogging the RAM at all times with reads and writes. Now, this did limit them somewhat though, as due to a memory controller bug, you could not directly execute code from RAM and you had to manage data tightly due to no copy of RAM being present. A key element of the TOM chip is the object processor, which is like a command queue for the on-screen display in modern GPUs now. It simply reads 64 bits at a time of pixel data as it's fed via a set of object lists and draws to the screen at a raster level. This was still based on old 16-bit and 8-bit game types. Now, the lack of buffers or caches were the machine's biggest omission, which slowed down its otherwise strong performance. The object processor did at least have double buffering for its line feeds, which alongside its async clock cycle meant it could display one line while the other was being filled and then flip at the mid or the end horizontal sync phase. Now, unlike the Blitter, the object processor and the system bus though, the graphics processor in TOM was 32-bit, just like the other chip in Jerry. Now, this is a DSP that is dedicated to sound, but it can be multi-purpose and complement other tasks. Famously, John Carmack used it to support Doom. It can deliver 8 or more channels of sound, but it is limited by how much you can squeeze from its 8 kilobit internal scratch pad. The sound effects processing and quality were very good, especially for a cartridge-based system, but it did often sound like an Amiga with a mixture of samples, chip sounds and FM synthesis, which is never a bad thing, but it wasn't really a leap forward. Now, in addition to these powerful processors of the time, the entire system was built on the 32-bit 68000 I just mentioned, which was another big issue overall. It was simply too slow and too old to keep up in this new world. This and the internal 64-bit bus, along with its dual 32-bit RISC chips that worked in parallel, and this is why it was marketed as the first 64-bit console, but this was still an era of the bit wars, that original teraflop. Now, compounding this was the machine's architects actually recommending you write ASM or assembly code for the RISC chips to drive your game and rendering logic. C code compiled down to run in parallel was the only way to make it sing, something not that common at the time. Running parallelized code is hard enough now, but having to run within the internal RAM amplified this with the bus contention and mutex control, alongside those strange hardware bugs, such as having to read before you write on the DSP, otherwise it would fail. All of that compounded the limitations of the system and the developers. Now, the other was that the 68K was so ubiquitous that mainly most people knew how to write assembly for this, and as such they used it to drive the game and the render loop, which limited the speed and is one of the big reasons many of the games perform slowly on it, because the 68K only runs at half the clock rate of the DSP and the secondary CPU. This limits the game speed and complexity. It was modern though in design, using bitmapped images to create screen, and combined with its wide bus, limited DMA action, blitter and dual processor, it could merge, blend and fill the screen with rich and colourful images, especially with its dual colour modes of true 24-bit colour or the proprietary CRY 16-bit colour system, which reserved a full 8 bits just to the luminance of the pixel. This enabled excellent gradients and shading for less depth. In addition, it also enabled cheap lighting effects for a single channel changes of luminosity at a per pixel level, which also aided the bandwidth across the entire system. Now, this was needed as you had so much traffic across the 5 processors and that limited bus width, all vying for time and lanes. It made the system very congested. The limited pool of games and almost immediate threat of failure from launch meant it was never pushed hard enough during its commercial lifespan to enable a true evaluation of its potential. Promise or not though, numbers mean little then and now. Software makes hardware sing, and there's no better place to start than A for this Atari Jaguar review and its library. To keep this focused, this will only concentrate on the A titles for the Atari Jaguar, but fret not, next week will be everything else that's left. Air Cars was a very late and limited release on the Atari Jaguar, coming out in 1997, but rare does not mean good, and this certainly isn't good. Now, if that completely apathetic voice doesn't tell you anything about this game, then nothing will. It's effectively a first-person shooter, and you drive around in an air car or a tank, picking up bazookas, shotguns and bullets and just blowing everything up. Your mission is to start and blow up certain areas of the map, so multiple comm towers, buildings and anything else that's trying to attack you, and you're basically boxed off into a little rectangle around the entire map, so you can't go anywhere, but it is open area. You can't fly, you can't go anywhere else, you can speed up, turn around, reverse, and the enemy is quite tough, but it really isn't a lot of fun. Not then, not now. Bearing in mind this came out in 1997, and that means that it wasn't really pushing the boundaries even when it was made in 95 due to all the issues of the Atari Jaguar. It had a very late and limited release, which is what makes it so rare. This was even when the N64 was out, so this isn't really pushing the boundaries. Yes, it's more stable and more solid 3D than what you saw on the PlayStation or the Saturn, but it really isn't as detailed, smooth and good looking then or now. This is a game to skip. If you see it online for a fortune, don't buy it, it's not worth playing. Performance is just as bad, but resolution is actually quite impressive, and that's something consistent across the Atari Jaguar due to the way that it drew everything and used that blitter, which was the very impressive piece of hardware in terms of what it could do for 3D grid shading and Z-depth, meant that a lot of games did actually look and run at a pretty high resolution. Here Air Cars, like many 3D games on the Jaguar, runs at a full 345 by 288, which is not to be sniffed at considering the age and limitations of the machine, but the frame rate does take a hit. But this isn't hardware specific, as other titles I'll cover later certainly run this much better, still using 3D.
Target destroyed. Reactivator installed. Target destroyed.
No, this is not an Amiga demo of the day. In fact, this is Atari Karts, quite clearly cashing in on the popularity of Nintendo's Super Mario Kart on the SNES. This really is a SNES emulator through and through. It's actually slightly more impressive on a technical level than the Super Nintendo game due to that parallax scrolling depth in the background, along with that Mode 7 emulated scrolling and rotation and sprite scaling, which was its base for development. That was its main core. It came from a demo. And that, along with the Amiga constructed music soundtrack, again is why it sounds like an Amiga demo. But overall, it isn't as impressive as Super Mario Kart. It doesn't look as good, the artistic design is very flat and bland, and the characters and the AI are not as good, and more specifically the weapons and the pickups and the combat is just pretty boring overall. It certainly has the pace at a locked 50Hz or 60Hz in the US, pretty much a couple of stutters every now and then, but generally it's much slower, less frantic, and the weapons and the pickups are just nowhere near the level of Super Mario Kart, or is the AI, so actually it's not as much fun, even if it is a pretty impressive 2D, 3D come racer. And it certainly cemented the fact that it could compete and beat the Super Nintendo on a technical chops front, but that really wasn't that much of a target considering this came out a good 3 or 4 years after Nintendo's Beast. Alien vs Predator, the true killer app and system seller that carried a great deal of weight at the time. I myself was actually very tempted to buy an Atari Jaguar due to this Rebellion title. It was and still is an excellent example of the machine's graphical grunt in both 3D texture mapping, sprite scaling and sound processing. But unfortunately, it is one of those games that hasn't aged that well due to the limitations of what the machines and the game design were back then. There's lots of issues with the game in terms of playing it now. One of the things is when you play as the Predator and go into that infrared mode, it's actually just a mess of pixels. The blending operations on the pixel shaders here on the blitter as well also mean that colours can go into a rainbow effect as they blend across other colour types, which can actually make it even harder to see. And then throw on top of that 3D map on top of the actual graphics themselves means it's almost impossible to see where the hell you're supposed to go and what you're supposed to attack. That, combined with the fact that the different functionalities makes the Marines most fun but also one of the hardest, and the Predator is probably the most enjoyable in terms of the sound and delivery, but it isn't really a game that I would recommend you'd spend £60-70 on to play, because I guarantee you're probably going to get bored with the layout and map design. Very corridor based, open a door, go in, open other areas, use the computer system to find the map and then explore further, pick up weapons. You play as the alien, your job there is to save the Queen. You play as the Predator, your job there is to kill the Queen. And you play as a Marine, and your job there is to not get your arse chewed. Effectively, it's a great technical game to show off the power of the Atari Jaguar. Performance is again pretty good considering what it's pushing around, with again that decent resolution of 345 by 288, even if it doesn't really hit a lock solid 25 FPS, fluctuating quite heavily once you get a couple of sprites on screen. But it's still fun, it's pretty smooth, and it's certainly a much better looking and performing game than Air Cars that kicked this whole list off. Just don't expect it to blow you away. Well, aside the sound, which is still actually quite impressive. Attack of the Mutant Penguins was an early title on the Atari Jaguar that was cashing in on the popularity of Lemmings, and it wasn't as good, but it was actually quite enjoyable and still is. With a game that was ported later to the MS-DOS systems, you can probably have played this already, but it's still a fun looking puzzle title with you having to save those penguins who are freeform across the map. You have no direct control over them, you have to manipulate the enemies and get them safely back home before the doomsday weapon is triggered by the aliens. It's fun, it's enjoyable, and artistically it's actually pretty good and has aged well. So that's it, that's the end of part 1. The first A titles of the Atari Jaguar are covered, but there's much more to come in my next video, which will dedicate all the time to go right through the library from B to Z and show you just how good that is. But don't worry, you haven't got to wait long, it's all out next week. So for now, I'll leave you with a quick run through of some other titles you can look forward to on the Atari Jaguar, and that amazing game of Breakout, the Atari classic, is still here and runs on the Atari Jaguar. But I will give you a mild spoiler alert here. It runs at 25 FPS or 30 in the US, and it feels horrible to play due to that clunky digital input on the controller itself, that horrible D-pad, and the Atari Jaguar controller is horrendous anyway. And that's something that really let the machine down, but I cover that more, and every other title, including comparisons to other machines of the time and later. So be sure to check back in a week's time and enjoy more Atari Jaguar action. But for now, I'm out and normal service will be resumed. I'll see you in a week's time for more retro action.
But while you were sharpening your sword, do you know how I prepared for today?